The soft sound of clinking glasses filled the air as guests chatted in low, elegant tones. The restaurant glowed with warm, golden lights that reflected off the polished marble floors. Every table was dressed in white linen, silver cutlery neatly arranged, and fresh flowers placed in crystal vases. The piano in the corner added to the charm, its melody floating gently across the room. It was the kind of place where the wealthy came to feel even more important. Amid all the shine and laughter, she moved quietly between the tables, carrying trays and refilling glasses. Her uniform was simple, a little worn from long hours of work, but always clean and tidy. She didn't stand out, not because she didn't want to, but because she knew people like the ones who dined here rarely noticed faces like hers. She had worked in this restaurant for almost 2 years. Every evening she arrived early, tied her hair neatly, and started her shift with a smile. The other waiters liked her for her calmness. She never complained, even when she had to stay past midnight cleaning up. Most guests never looked twice at her, except to wave for water or ask for the bill. Still, she kept her voice soft and polite no matter how tired she was. This particular evening was busier than usual. The restaurant was hosting a private dinner for a group of high-profile businessmen who were regulars. They were known for being loud, generous with money, and sometimes careless with their words. When they laughed, the sound carried across the whole room, drawing glances from other guests. The waitress had served them before. She remembered how one of them always joked with the staff in a way that made people uncomfortable. He was rich, confident, and used to being the center of attention. His tailored suit, shiny watch, and sharp smile gave away everything about him. He liked to make people laugh, even if his jokes came at someone else's expense. That night, the same man sat at the head of the table surrounded by his friends. His laughter was the loudest, his words the boldest. A few of his friends joined in while others stayed quiet, not wanting to challenge him. The waitress approached their table, tray balanced carefully in her hands, ready to refill their glasses. She placed the wine bottle gently on the table and poured just the right amount into each glass. Her movements were precise, practiced from years of repetition. She didn't say much, just nodded politely when someone said thank you. But as she turned to leave, one of the men at the table made a remark loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "You move like a dancer," he said, his tone playful but mocking. "Maybe you should perform for us instead of serving." The group laughed. The waitress froze for a second, unsure how to respond. She forced a polite smile and tried to step away, but the man continued, clearly enjoying the attention. "Come on, don't be shy," he said. "Maybe you can play something for us later. You do know how to play the piano, right?" His friends chuckled again. It was meant to be a joke, just another moment of entertainment for them. But the question hit her harder than anyone could have guessed, because yes, she did know how to play the piano. In fact, it had once been her entire world. Long before she wore a waitress uniform, her hands had danced across piano keys in small competitions and music schools. She had dreamed of playing on big stages, of hearing applause that wasn't just polite but filled with real admiration. But life doesn't always go as planned. When her family faced financial troubles, she had to stop her studies. The piano lessons ended. The dream faded. And soon she was working double shifts in restaurants just to make sure there was food at home. The man didn't know any of that, of course. To him, she was just another face in uniform. His question was meant to tease, not to wound. But it did both. She bowed her head slightly and replied softly, "I'm afraid I haven't played in a long time, sir." He grinned, sensing a chance to make her even more uncomfortable. "Oh, come on," he said, leaning back in his chair. "Don't tell me you're afraid of a little attention. If you play even one song, I'll give you a tip you won't forget." The waitress looked down, pretending to laugh lightly, though inside her chest tightened. She wanted to walk away, but she also didn't want to lose her job by upsetting an important customer. The other waiters nearby looked at her with sympathy. Everyone knew this guest could be cruel in his jokes, but nobody dared say anything. At the far end of the room, the pianist finished his evening piece and stood up to take a short break. The piano now sat alone in the corner, silent and shining under the warm lights. The timing couldn't have been worse. The wealthy man noticed it too. He snapped his fingers and said, "Look, the piano's free. Perfect chance for our waitress here to show us what she can do." The table erupted in laughter again. Some guests looked around, unsure if it was appropriate to laugh, but they followed his lead. The sound echoed through the restaurant. and a few people from nearby tables turned to see what was happening. The waitress felt her face grow warm. Her hands trembled slightly as she held the tray close to her chest. The room suddenly felt smaller, heavier. She wished she could disappear. But deep inside, a quiet voice told her not to let them see her hurt. The manager, noticing the scene from across the room, quickly stepped in. He smiled at the guests and said, "I'm sorry, sir, our staff isn't trained for entertainment. I can ask the pianist to return if you'd like another song." But the man waved his hand dismissively. No, I want to hear her play. Come on, it's just for fun. We'll clap, I promise." The laughter returned. Even the manager looked helpless now. He turned to the waitress and gave her a nervous look, silently asking if she wanted to go along with it or not. For a moment, she considered refusing. She wanted to say she couldn't, that it was against the rules. But then she looked at the piano again. It had been years since she'd touched one. Her fingers ached with memory. The sound of music she once loved came back to her. The feel of ivory keys, the echo of notes filling a quiet room. Maybe this was her chance. Not to prove something to them, but to remind herself of who she once was. She set down the tray on a nearby counter and slowly walked toward the piano. The laughter died down a little as people realized she was actually going to do it. Her steps were quiet but steady. She reached the piano, touched the polished surface gently, and sat down on the stool. Her reflection shimmered faintly in the glossy black finish. The restaurant grew unusually still. Even those who hadn't been watching before now turned their heads. The wealthy man smirked and leaned back, arms crossed, waiting for her to embarrass herself. The waitress took a deep breath. Her heart raced, but her hands felt calm as they hovered above the keys. For a second, she closed her eyes, remembering the smell of her childhood home where her mother used to sit nearby while she practiced. She could almost hear her mother's voice telling her to keep going, no matter what life threw her way. Then, softly, she pressed the first key. A single note echoed through the restaurant, pure and delicate. The sound carried far, reaching even the quiet corners of the room. Something about that note silenced the whispers. She pressed another, then another, and suddenly her fingers began to move on their own. The melody was gentle at first, filled with longing and emotion. The notes connected like threads weaving a story. The piano, untouched for hours, now came alive under her hands. The laughter that had filled the room minutes ago was gone. All eyes were on her. The waiters froze mid-step. Guests turned in their seats, and even the wealthy man's grin slowly faded. It was as if time had stopped. The sound of her playing carried through the room like a gentle breeze moving through an open field. At first, no one breathed. People had expected a few clumsy notes, maybe a nervous laugh, but what they heard instead was something entirely different. Each note came with emotion, not just skill. It wasn't loud or showy. It was soft, warm, and full of life. The waitress played as if she had stepped into another world. Her back was straight, her eyes slightly closed, and her fingers moved gracefully across the piano keys. The notes seemed to tell a story, a quiet story of struggle, patience, and hidden dreams. The restaurant, once filled with laughter and clinking glasses, had gone silent. Even the servers at the far end stopped what they were doing. The cooks peeked from the kitchen door. A couple at a nearby table leaned closer, unable to look away. The wealthy man who had teased her sat frozen. His smirk faded slowly, replaced by surprise, then disbelief. He had thought this would be a joke, something to make his friends laugh. But now he was the one sitting quietly, realizing how wrong he had been. The music filled the air, wrapping around everyone like a soft blanket. It wasn't a song people recognized, but it didn't matter. It was beautiful. It was real, and it came from a place of truth. After a few minutes, the melody changed. Her fingers moved faster, more confidently. Her body leaned slightly with the rhythm, like she was remembering every note she had ever played as a child. Every strike of the key echoed years of practice, sacrifice, and longing. Her face was calm, but her eyes shone with something deep, something that came from the part of her heart she had kept locked away for too long. The guests could feel it too. Some looked down, almost embarrassed, realizing how easily they had judged her. Others simply watched, lost in the sound. Even the man who had started the mockery leaned forward now, his expression softening. For the first time that night, he didn't speak. When the final note faded into silence, the waitress kept her hands on the piano for a moment. as if she wasn't ready to let go. The room stayed quiet. No one moved. Then slowly, one person began to clap. Another joined, and soon the entire restaurant filled with applause. It wasn't polite clapping, and it was genuine. People stood up smiling, amazed. Some even whistled. The waitress looked up, a bit confused by the reaction. She had expected laughter again, or maybe silence. But what she saw were faces full of admiration. Her heart raced, her cheeks flushed, but she smiled. A shy, grateful smile that said more than words could. The wealthy man finally stood up. For a moment he just looked at her. His friends glanced at him, waiting to see what he would say. He took a breath and said quietly, "That was incredible." The words hung in the air. She nodded politely and said, "Thank you, sir." It was a simple response, but it carried a quiet strength. The man sat back down slowly. His friends didn't joke anymore. Instead, one of them leaned over and whispered something about how talented she was. Another asked if she had ever performed professionally. The waitress shook her head and replied softly, "I used to play when I was younger. I had to stop." The guests looked at each other, sensing that there was more to her story than she was saying, but they didn't ask. They just watched her walk away quietly, returning to her work as if nothing had happened. As she went back behind the counter, the manager approached her. His eyes were wide with amazement. "I had no idea you could play like that," he said softly. She smiled and replied, "It's been a long time." The manager nodded. "You should have told me. That was the most beautiful thing I've heard in this restaurant." She didn't know what to say, so she just smiled again and continued working. Her hands were steady, but her heart was still beating fast. Meanwhile, at the table, the man who had humiliated her was unusually quiet. He kept looking toward the piano, lost in thought. His friends tried to start another conversation, but he wasn't listening. Something about the moment had unsettled him, not in a bad way, but in a way that made him think. He realized how quickly he had judged someone based on what they looked like, how easily he had turned his power into mockery. He didn't like how that made him feel. The night went on. The restaurant returned to its usual rhythm, but something had changed. The guests talked about the waitress more than the food. The pianist who returned from his break even asked her which piece she had played, impressed by her natural touch. When her shift ended, she walked home in the cool night air, her shoes softly clicking against the sidewalk. The city lights reflected off the pavement and the sound of traffic hummed in the distance. She felt lighter than she had in years. For the first time since she started that job, she didn't feel invisible. She thought about her mother, who used to say, "No gift ever disappears, it just waits for you to find it again." Tonight, she had found hers, but she also knew this wasn't the end of the story. Something about that evening felt like the beginning of a change, not just for her, but for the people who had witnessed it. The next day, when she arrived at work, people greeted her differently. Some of the staff smiled at her with admiration. A few customers even asked if she would be playing again that evening. The manager seemed proud, introducing her to new guests as the one who surprised us all last night. It was strange. She hadn't done it for attention. In fact, she hadn't planned to do it at all. But deep inside, it felt good to be seen. Not as a waitress, not as a servant, but as someone who carried something special inside. Later that evening, the same group of businessmen returned. The wealthy man walked in with a different expression this time. He wasn't laughing or making loud jokes. When he saw her, he gave a polite nod, something he had never done before. She returned the gesture with a small smile. When he sat down, he ordered quietly, not interrupting anyone. The other guests noticed the change too. He seemed thoughtful, almost humbled. After their meal, as he stood to leave, he approached her. The restaurant grew a little quiet again, people sensing something important was about to happen. He looked at her for a moment, then said, "I owe you an apology. I was wrong to speak to you the way I did last night." "What you did, it was unforgettable." The waitress didn't know what to say. She just nodded and said softly, "Thank you, sir." He reached into his pocket and placed an envelope on the counter. "It's not for what happened," he said. "It's because talent like yours shouldn't go unseen. Maybe this can help you get back to it." Before she could respond, he smiled faintly and walked away. Inside the envelope was a simple note and some money. Not a fortune, but enough to pay for piano lessons or maybe a small keyboard to practice at home. She stared at it for a long time, then folded it carefully and placed it in her bag. It wasn't about the money. It was about what it meant: respect, recognition, and a quiet apology that didn't need more words. That night, when she returned home, she sat on her small balcony and looked out at the stars. The city lights flickered below, and somewhere far away, she could hear faint music drifting from another building. She closed her eyes and imagined herself at a grand piano again, playing not for applause, but for the peace it brought her. The world had a way of pushing people into corners, but sometimes one small act could bring light back into those corners. She realized she didn't just surprise a room full of strangers that night. She reminded herself that even after everything she had lost, her gift was still hers, and that gift, once hidden, had just begun to shine again. The next few days passed like a quiet dream. Every time the waitress walked into the restaurant, people greeted her differently. The cook smiled more. The other waiters treated her with a new kind of respect, and even the guests seemed to notice her now. It wasn't just about what had happened that night. It was the way she had carried herself since. Something inside her had shifted. She didn't rush as much anymore. Her steps were calmer, her shoulders straighter. It wasn't pride, but a quiet peace that came from knowing she had something inside her that no one could take away. The piano still stood in the corner of the restaurant, polished and shining under the soft lights. Every time she passed by, she felt a gentle pull toward it. It was strange. For years, she had avoided even looking at a piano because it reminded her of everything she had lost. But now it gave her comfort, like an old friend she had finally found again. A few days later, the manager called her into his office. She entered nervously, wondering if she had done something wrong. But his expression was warm. "You remember the night you played the piano?" he asked. She nodded slowly. He smiled. "People haven't stopped talking about it. We've had several guests asking if you'll be playing again. They said it was the best part of their evening." Her eyes widened slightly. "Oh, I didn't mean to." He raised his hand kindly. "You didn't do anything wrong. In fact, I think it would be wonderful if you played a short piece every evening, maybe just before closing. Nothing fancy, just something simple to end the night beautifully." She hesitated. "You really want me to?" "I do," he said. "You belong at that piano more than anyone else I've seen. And if it makes you happy, I think it'll make others happy too." His words filled her with a quiet warmth. For so long she had felt invisible, but now she was being asked to do something she truly loved. That evening, after finishing her last round of tables, she sat at the piano once again. This time no one forced her. No one laughed. The lights were dim, the restaurant half empty, and only a few guests remained. She began to play a soft tune, something simple, almost like a lullaby. Her fingers moved gently, the notes floating through the air like small pieces of memory. The sound was soft but powerful, carrying emotion that touched everyone listening. A few people stopped eating to watch. The bartender leaned quietly against the counter, smiling to himself. When she finished, there was a moment of silence before soft clapping filled the room. It wasn't loud, but it was genuine, the kind of applause that came from the heart. She smiled shyly and stood up, bowing her head slightly before returning to her duties. From that day on, she played every evening. Some nights it was just for a few minutes. Other nights, when the crowd was quiet and the mood calm, she played longer. Each time, people listened, not because she was a waitress playing piano, but because her music made them feel something real. As the weeks went by, her story began to spread. People told their friends about the waitress with the golden hands. Soon, new guests came in, not just for the food, but to hear her play. The manager couldn't believe how much the restaurant's atmosphere had changed. He even placed a small sign near the entrance, "Live Piano by our own talented staff member," every evening. It wasn't a fancy advertisement, but it drew attention. The place started feeling warmer, more alive. The waitress, who had once been just another face in the background, was now the quiet heart of the restaurant. One night, as she played, she noticed someone familiar sitting in the back, the wealthy man who had once tried to humiliate her. He wasn't with a large group this time. He sat alone, a thoughtful look on his face. He listened quietly without saying a word until she finished her piece. After she stood up, he approached her. "I didn't think I'd be back here," he said softly. But I wanted to hear you play again, she smiled politely. I'm glad you came. He paused for a moment, then added, You changed something in me that night. I didn't realize how my words could hurt someone. I've been thinking about it ever since. The sincerity in his voice surprised her. She didn't know what to say, so she simply nodded. He looked at her for a moment longer, then said, I've spoken to a friend of mine who runs a music academy. They're always looking for talented people to teach or perform. If you're interested, I could arrange a meeting. You don't owe me anything. I just think your talent deserves a bigger stage. Her heart skipped a beat. She hadn't expected such an offer. For a moment, she felt unsure. She had been working for so long just to survive that the idea of going back to music seemed almost too good to believe. I don't know, she said quietly. It's been a long time since I studied. I don't think I'm ready. The man smiled gently. You said the same thing before you sat at that piano. And look what happened. She looked down, thinking about his words. There was truth in them. That night had started with humiliation, but it had ended with applause. Maybe this too was another beginning. After he left, she sat for a long time by the piano, running her fingers over the keys without playing. The idea of returning to music scared her. Not because she didn't want to, but because she was afraid of failing again. But deep down, she knew that fear was the same one that had kept her silent for years. Over the next few days, she couldn't stop thinking about it. Each time she played, she imagined what it would be like to study again, to perform not as a waitress but as a musician. She remembered the way her mother used to sit by the window, listening to her practice, smiling proudly. That memory gave her strength. Finally, she made her decision. One afternoon, after her shift ended, she took the small envelope the man had given her weeks before. Inside was still part of the money he had left. She added some of her savings and used it to pay for a meeting at the music academy he had mentioned. When she arrived, she was nervous. The sound of pianos echoed through the hallways. Students practiced in different rooms, each note carrying both confidence and effort. She felt out of place among them, but the staff welcomed her kindly. The director, an older woman with kind eyes, listened as she explained her story. Then she asked her to play. Her hands trembled as she sat at the piano once again, but as soon as she touched the keys, the nerves melted away. The music flowed easily, like it had been waiting for this moment. When she finished, the director smiled warmly and said, You have something rare. You play from your soul. We'd be honored to have you here. Tears filled her eyes, but she wiped them quickly and smiled. Thank you, she whispered. That evening, as she walked home, she felt lighter than she had in years. The city lights seemed brighter, the air fresher. She realized she had taken her first real step toward the dream she thought she had lost forever. The next day, when she returned to work, she told the manager about the opportunity. Instead of being disappointed, he smiled proudly. You deserve it, he said. We'll always have a place for you here, but if you can chase your dream again, go for it. She promised she'd still play until her classes began. And she did. Every evening, she filled the restaurant with music, soft, emotional, and full of gratitude. Each note was a reminder that even the hardest moments could lead to something beautiful. As she sat there night after night, playing for people who once didn't see her at all, she realized that her journey wasn't just about music. It was about rediscovering herself. The laughter that once stung her had turned into applause. The shame she once felt had turned into pride, and deep in her heart she knew this was only the beginning of something far greater than she had ever imagined. The morning sunlight poured gently through the thin curtains of her small apartment. The sound of the city waking up drifted through the window, cars honking in the distance, footsteps on the pavement below, a faint whistle from a street vendor. She sat at her tiny wooden table with a warm cup of tea, staring at the acceptance letter from the music academy. Even now, she couldn't believe it was real. For so long, her life had been a routine of work, bills, and quiet exhaustion. But now, for the first time in years, there was something waiting for her that didn't just pay the rent. It filled her with purpose. That afternoon, she began her first class. As she walked into the academy, her heart beat fast with both excitement and fear. The wide hallways echoed with the sounds of pianos, violins, and soft voices practicing scales. Every corner of the building felt alive with music. She carried her old notebook, its edges slightly worn, filled with pieces she had written years ago. When she reached the classroom, she paused at the door for a moment. Inside were younger students and some barely out of school, sitting by their instruments, talking and laughing. She hesitated, wondering if she belonged here among them, but then she remembered the night she played in the restaurant, the moment when fear turned into music. With that memory in her heart, she walked in quietly. The instructor, a gentle woman with sharp eyes and a warm smile, welcomed her. "We're glad to have you here," she said kindly. "Take a seat anywhere you like." The class began with simple exercises. Her hands trembled slightly as she placed them on the keys, but as soon as the first note sounded, her nerves started to melt away. The rhythm returned to her fingers like it had never left. She wasn't the fastest or the most confident in the room, but there was something in her playing that made the instructor pause and listen. A raw, honest emotion that came from deep inside. After class, a few students approached her, curious. "You play beautifully," one of them said. "Have you performed before?" She smiled humbly. "A long time ago," she replied. As the weeks passed, she found herself falling in love with music all over again. She practiced every day after work, sometimes until late at night. Her fingers grew sore, but she didn't mind. Every note she played brought her closer to the person she once dreamed of being. The restaurant still remained part of her life. She continued working evenings, playing short pieces for the guests. But now her music sounded different. It carried new energy, new confidence. People noticed it too. Some regulars even started coming just to listen to her play before closing. The manager often stood by the counter, smiling with quiet pride. One night, as she played softly, a man approached her table after the crowd had left. He introduced himself as an event organizer from the local cultural center. "I heard about you from one of my friends," he said. "We're hosting a small recital next month for emerging musicians. Would you be interested in performing?" The question left her stunned. Perform on a stage? It had been years since she'd even imagined that. She looked down for a moment, unsure of what to say. "I'm not sure I'm ready," she admitted softly. The man smiled. "You're more ready than you think. People connect to your music. That's what matters most." He handed her a card with the event details and left her with a simple nod. That night, she could barely sleep. The thought of standing on a stage again both thrilled and terrified her. What if she wasn't good enough? What if people laughed, or worse? What if they didn't feel anything at all? But then she remembered the night in the restaurant, the night she had been forced to play, and how that humiliation had turned into something beautiful. That night she hadn't played for approval. She had played from her heart. And maybe that was all she needed to do again, so she said yes. The next few weeks became a blur of preparation. Between shifts at the restaurant and classes at the academy, she practiced relentlessly. The other students noticed how focused she was. Even the instructor encouraged her, saying, "Don't be afraid to let your story come through your music. People remember honesty more than perfection." Finally, the night of the recital arrived. The small auditorium was softly lit, filled with people from the community, families, students, music lovers, and a few familiar faces from the restaurant. Even the manager had come, sitting proudly near the front row. Backstage, she paced nervously, her hands slightly shaking. She could hear the muffled sound of applause as the performer before her finished. Then her name was called. As she stepped onto the stage, the lights felt blinding for a moment. She took a deep breath and walked toward the piano. The room fell quiet. She sat down, placed her hands gently on the keys, and closed her eyes. For a brief second, the fear came rushing back. The same fear she had felt that night in the restaurant. The same fear she had carried for years. But then she remembered her mother's words. "No gift ever disappears." She opened her eyes and began to play. The first notes were soft, uncertain, but as she continued, something shifted. Her hands moved with ease, her heart guiding her fingers. The melody she played wasn't from any famous composer. It was her own creation. A piece she had written in her notebook long ago when she still believed she could make a life through music. Each note carried a piece of her journey, the struggle, the humiliation, the quiet resilience. The audience could feel it. It wasn't just music they were hearing. It was her story told without words. As she reached the final part of the piece, her playing grew stronger. The melody rose and filled the hall, reaching every corner. People leaned forward, completely drawn in. And when the last note finally faded into silence, the room stayed still for a few seconds, as if no one wanted to break the spell. Then slowly applause began, and soft at first, then louder, growing into a wave of appreciation. Some people even stood clapping and cheering. She sat there stunned, her hands still resting on the keys. Tears welled in her eyes, but she smiled through them. The light from above made her eyes glisten. As she stood and bowed, she spotted the wealthy man in the back row, clapping with a proud smile on his face. Next to him sat the music academy director, also applauding warmly. The sight filled her with emotion she couldn't describe. After the recital, people approached her, congratulating her, telling her how deeply her music had touched them. The director came forward and said, "You have a rare gift, the kind that reminds people what music is really for. Would you consider performing again? Perhaps in one of our larger events?" Her voice trembled slightly as she replied, "I would love to." That night, as she walked home, the cool air brushed against her face, and she looked up at the sky. The stars seemed brighter than ever. She felt free, not because of the applause, but because she had finally found herself again. The woman who had once been a waitress mocked for her uniform was now standing tall, her name whispered in admiration by people who had once overlooked her. She knew there was still a long road ahead, more learning, more work, more courage to gather. But this time she wasn't afraid. She had faced humiliation and turned it into music. She had taken her pain and turned it into strength, and now, every note she played carried a message, not just for her, but for anyone who had ever been underestimated. Because sometimes, all it takes is one brave moment to remind the world who you truly are. The next morning felt different. When she woke up, the sunlight through her window seemed softer, almost like the world was greeting her with quiet applause. The recital still replayed in her mind, the lights, the audience, the sound of her own heart beating louder than the piano. She smiled faintly, still unable to believe how everything had changed. For so long she had lived in the shadows, unnoticed and unimportant to the world around her. But now people had seen her. They had felt her music, and for the first time in years she didn't feel invisible. At the restaurant that evening, something had shifted. The staff greeted her differently, with warmth and admiration. Even the guests, some of whom had been there the night she was humiliated, now looked at her with respect. Word had spread quickly about her performance. Someone had even uploaded a small video clip of her playing, and it was being shared among people in town. When she arrived, the manager came over with a proud smile. "You've brought honor to this place," he said warmly. "People are asking if you'll play again tonight. They can't get enough of your music," she laughed softly. "I'll play," she said, "but not for fame. I'll play because it makes me happy." That night, as she sat by the piano, the restaurant was filled with quiet anticipation. When she began to play, the sound floated through the room, gentle and emotional. Couples paused their conversations, waiters slowed their steps, and even the noise from the kitchen softened. It wasn't just background music anymore. It was something that made everyone stop and feel. After she finished, the room erupted in applause. Some even stood to clap for her. It was a small restaurant, but that night it felt like the grandest concert hall. Among the guests was a well-dressed woman who had been watching closely from the corner. When the performance ended, she approached the piano. "You play with soul," the woman said kindly. "I haven't heard something that pure in a long time. Would you consider performing at our charity gala next month?" The invitation took her by surprise. A charity gala was no small event. It meant performing in front of wealthy and influential people. Her heart raced as she replied softly, I'm honored. I'll think about it." The woman smiled. "Please do. I'll send you the details. We'd be lucky to have you." As the woman walked away, she sat still for a moment, her hands trembling slightly on her lap. She couldn't believe what was happening. Only a few months ago, she was being mocked for simply existing. Now, people were asking her to perform at places she had never dreamed of entering. When she told her instructor at the music academy the next day, the teacher's eyes lit up with joy. "That's a wonderful opportunity," she said. "It's time your music reaches more people. But remember, don't let the pressure steal your peace. Play the way you always do, Kat, with honesty." The following weeks were filled with practice and preparation. She worked hard at the restaurant, but every free moment went into rehearsing. The gala performance was not just another chance to play. It was a test of how far she had come and how much courage she had gained. Sometimes, during her late-night practices, she would pause and think about the man who once mocked her. The memory of that moment still stung, but now it no longer defined her. In a strange way, his cruelty had pushed her to prove herself. Without that humiliation, she might never have rediscovered her strength. The day of the charity gala finally arrived. She stood before the large mirror in her tiny room, wearing a simple but elegant dress she had borrowed from a friend at the academy. Her reflection looked different, not because of the dress but because of the quiet confidence in her eyes. When she reached the grand hall, she was taken aback by the beauty of it. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling, and every table was decorated with soft candlelight. The guests, dressed in fine clothes, chatted and laughed over glasses of wine. She was led backstage where the piano stood waiting for her. As she sat down to warm up her fingers, she noticed the wealthy man who had once tried to humiliate her entering the hall with a group of his business friends. Her heart skipped a beat. Of all people, he was here too. For a moment, doubt crept in. Would he recognize her? Would he remember what he did? She closed her eyes and took a deep breath. It didn't matter. She wasn't the same person anymore. She wasn't the frightened waitress he had laughed at. She was a musician now, someone who had earned her place through hard work and passion. When her turn came, the host announced her name and invited her to the stage. As she walked out under the bright lights, she could feel hundreds of eyes watching her. But she kept her gaze steady. She sat down, placed her hands gently on the keys, and let her mind go quiet. Then she began to play. The melody she chose that night was different from anything she had played before. It was soft, yet powerful. It spoke of pain, but also healing. It told a story of being broken and finding strength again. Each note carried a piece of her past, but also her triumph over it. The audience listened in silence. Some closed their eyes, letting the music wash over them. Even the waiters stopped moving for a while just to listen. As she played, her eyes caught sight of the man sitting at one of the front tables. His expression had changed. The arrogance that once lived in his eyes was gone, replaced by quiet surprise. He looked at her with recognition, and something that almost looked like regret. But she didn't play for him. She played for herself, for every moment she had doubted her worth and for every person who had ever been underestimated. When the last note faded into silence, the room stayed still for a few long seconds. Then the applause came, loud, genuine, and lasting. People rose to their feet, clapping, cheering, some even wiping their eyes. She stood up, took a gentle bow, and smiled, not out of pride, but gratitude. After the performance, people came to her, offering praise and asking about her music. The event organizer thanked her deeply, saying her performance had touched everyone in the room. As she turned to leave, she saw the wealthy man standing near the entrance, waiting. For a moment, she thought about avoiding him, but then she realized she didn't have to hide anymore. She walked toward him calmly. He looked at her, his voice quieter than she had ever heard it. "I remember you," he said, "from that night, at the restaurant. I was wrong about you. You have more grace and strength than anyone I've met." She looked at him with calm eyes and simply replied, "We all have something special in us. Sometimes it just takes the right moment to be seen." He nodded, unable to say more. As she left the hall, the night air felt cool and gentle against her skin. She walked through the quiet streets, her heels clicking softly on the pavement. A sense of peace filled her heart. The lights from the city shimmered around her, and in the distance, she could hear faint music from another event, a reminder that the world was full of stories like hers, waiting to be heard. For the first time, she didn't feel like she was chasing a dream. She was living it. Back in her apartment, she placed her hands on the piano keys once more, playing softly into the night. She didn't need an audience now. She played because it was who she was, a woman who had faced the world's cruelty and turned it into beauty. Her journey wasn't over yet. In fact, it was just beginning. The gala performance had opened new doors. People wanted to collaborate with her, record her music, invite her to events in other cities. Opportunities she had once thought impossible were now within reach. But as she played that night alone in her little room, she knew one thing for certain: no stage, no applause, no fame could ever mean more than the simple joy of playing from the heart. And that, she thought with a smile, was what true success really felt like. Weeks turned into months, and life began to take on a rhythm she had never known before. Her days were filled with music, lessons, and performances. Every week seemed to bring a new invitation. A small concert here, a collaboration there. People wanted to hear her story, not just her music, but through it all she stayed humble. She still lived in her small apartment, still made her own tea in the mornings, and still visited the restaurant where it all began. The piano there had become something special to her, not just an instrument, but a reminder of how far she had come. One quiet evening, she sat alone at that same piano after closing hours. The lights were dim and the air smelled faintly of coffee and fresh bread. She played softly, her fingers moving without thought, as if the piano and her heart were one. The manager standing by the counter listened quietly. When she finished, he said with a warm smile, "You've come a long way. I remember the first time you sat there and nervous, scared, shaking. Look at you now," she smiled gently. "This piano changed my life," she said softly. "Or maybe it reminded me who I was supposed to be." He nodded. "You did that yourself. The piano was just waiting for you to believe again." The next few months were busy. She started working with the Academy on a new music program for underprivileged children. Kids who couldn't afford lessons, but had the same spark she once had. She wanted to give them what she never had, a chance to be heard. Every weekend, she would sit with those children in a small hall, showing them how to place their fingers, how to feel the rhythm, how to listen to the silence between the notes. Some of them were shy, afraid to make mistakes. Others were wild with excitement, pressing random keys and laughing. But she loved them all equally. One day, a little girl came up to her after class and said, "Miss, when I play the piano, I feel like I can say things I can't say with words." She knelt down and smiled. "That's exactly what music is for," she said. "It's your heart talking when your mouth can't." Those words stayed with her that night as she walked home under the streetlights. She realized she wasn't just teaching music. She was passing on a light that someone else might carry further than she ever could. One morning, she received a letter from the same wealthy man who had once humiliated her. It was short, written in a neat hand. He wrote that her performance at the gala had changed him, that he had thought about it often, and it made him realize how wrong he had been. He wanted to support her new music program for children, to help her expand it so more kids could learn. For a long moment, she just stared at the letter. The same man who had once looked down on her now wanted to help her build something good. Life had truly come full circle. She didn't respond immediately. She needed time to think. That weekend, as she sat in her class with the children laughing around her, she made her decision. When the next letter went out, it was short and honest. She accepted his help, not out of gratitude for what he once did, but because she knew the good that could come from it. Forgiveness, she realized, wasn't about erasing the past. It was about letting it stop hurting. Months later, the new music center opened, a bright, cheerful place filled with instruments, light, and the sound of children's laughter. The man attended the opening quietly, standing in the back. She thanked him publicly, not by name, but by saying, "Sometimes life teaches us lessons in unexpected ways. What once broke us can become the reason we rise." He smiled faintly and left without saying much, but his eyes told her everything. As time passed, she became known in her town as the woman who turned pain into music. Her story inspired others, people who had been overlooked, people who had been told they weren't enough. Her performances drew crowds, but she never chased fame. For her, success wasn't about the spotlight. It was about touching lives quietly, one note at a time. One evening, after a small concert at the community hall, she walked to the piano alone while the audience left. The hall was almost empty, the lights dim. She sat down and began to play the same piece she had played on the night everything changed. The melody that had once come from her sadness, but now carried warmth and peace. As her fingers danced across the keys, she thought about the journey that had brought her here. The laughter, the humiliation, the courage, the applause. Every moment had shaped her. And now all that remained was gratitude. When she finished, she stayed seated for a long time, listening to the silence that followed. It wasn't empty anymore. It was full of peace. The next morning, she received a call from a well-known orchestra in another city. They had seen one of her performances online and wanted her to join them for a tour across the country. Her first thought wasn't excitement, it was disbelief. Then slowly, a smile spread across her face. That night, she stood on her balcony looking out at the glowing city below. The stars above twinkled faintly. She thought about how far she had come, from a waitress barely getting by, to a musician who had found her purpose. She whispered softly to herself, "Maybe this is what my mother meant when she said no gift ever disappears." Before leaving for the tour, she visited the restaurant one last time. The manager hugged her warmly, wishing her luck. "You'll always have a place here," he said. "This piano will always wait for you," she smiled. "And I'll always come back." Then as a small gesture, she played one final song before she left. A simple, gentle tune that filled the restaurant with warmth. The few people there that night listened quietly, unaware that they were witnessing the end of a chapter that had begun right in that very spot. As the last note faded, she closed her eyes, smiled, and whispered a quiet thank you to the world, to the piano, and to herself. The tour was more beautiful than she ever imagined. City after city, hall after hall, she shared her music with strangers who became friends through sound. Every performance felt like telling her story all over again, not through words, but through melodies that carried the weight of her journey. At each show, there were moments when she looked at the crowd and thought about the waitress she once was, the one who was mocked, who felt invisible, who nearly gave up. And in those moments she played harder, with more love, as if to remind that past version of herself that everything had been worth it. Months later, she returned home. The city felt the same, but she was not. She had grown stronger, calmer, and more grateful. She had touched lives, and in doing so healed her own. When she entered the music center again, the children ran to greet her, their faces full of excitement. "Miss, we saw your concert online," one shouted. "You are amazing." She laughed, hugging them tightly. "You all are the amazing ones," she said. "Never stop playing. Never stop believing in your music." That night, after the children left, she sat once again by the piano. She played quietly, just for herself. Outside, the sky was painted with the soft glow of dusk, and the city hummed gently in the background. As the final notes drifted through the air, she closed her eyes and smiled. Life had come full circle. The woman who was once humiliated had become the woman who healed others through her gift. The waitress who was once ignored had become a name people spoke with admiration, but she never forgot the truth she had learned along the way, that dignity isn't given by others, and dreams don't die because of someone's laughter. They live as long as one heart dares to believe again, and so, with quiet grace and a soul full of gratitude, she kept playing, one melody at a time, reminding the world that no one should ever be underestimated, because behind every humble face might live a heart that can change the world with a single song.